Previously, we discussed three features of behaviorism: Pavlovian conditioning, classical conditioning, and reciprocal determinism. Today, we are going to discuss the very important feature of behaviorism, that is operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner is an American psychologist and behaviorist who is known for his contribution in behaviorism. He published a book by the name of Verbal Behavior in 1957. This book is theoretical and involved experimental research. In this book, he himself wrote about verbal behavior, that behavior reinforced through the mediation of other persons. So he emphasized that any behavior which needs to be determined has to be reinforced by the mediation of other persons, by intervening or by providing feedback by the other person. Then he went on to talk about those persons who must be responding in ways which have been conditioned precisely in order to reinforce the behavior of the speaker. So it's not just random. It's the mediation of the persons who are prepared, conditioned, trained to provide a precise reinforcement which is required, which is relevant and appropriate for a speaker to develop a particular behavior. He went on to say that verbal behavior is shaped and sustained by verbal environment. So verbal environment is crucial, according to Skinner, by people who respond to behavior in certain ways because of the practices of the group of which they are members. So their affiliation to that group makes them distinctive. These practices and the resulting interaction of speakers and listener yield the phenomena which are considered here under the rubric of verbal behavior. Now, these are certain keywords that we need to keep in our mind in order to understand verbal behavior, which is shaped by verbal environment. And how it is shaped? It is shaped by the reinforcement given in a specific manner by a group of people who belong to that community, where the interaction of speaker and listener is dynamic or yields the phenomena which is considered here under the rubric of verbal behavior, which means the parameters of verbal behavior. Skinner's theory of verbal behavior is basically an extension of his general theory of learning, which is known as operant conditioning. Skinner introduced this theory in 1938, and according to this theory, it looks at behavior, which is changing of behavior by the use of reinforcement, which is given after the desired response. So it is the changing of behavior which takes place by the use of reinforcement, but that reinforcement which is given after the desired response. Skinner identified three types of responses or operants that follow a certain behavior. Number one, neutral operants. Number two, reinforcers. And number three, punishers. Neutral operants are the ones which refers to the responses from the environment that neither increase nor decrease the probability of a behavior being repeated. Reinforcers are the responses from the environment that increase the probability of a behavior being repeated. And punishers are the responses from the environment that decrease the probability of a behavior being repeated. Now we take you to the operant conditioning chamber, where we will show you the experiment done by Skinner on a pigeon.
can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behaviour is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behaviour and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behaviour, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behaviour of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot in the wall, and you can reinforce with food, but you don't reinforce every time. You're perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. And there is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because one of the schedules which is very effective with rats or pigeons is what we call a variable ratio schedule, and that is at the heart of all gambling devices and has the same effect. The pigeon can become a pathological gambler just as a person can. Now, the fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule makes it easy for us to interpret the case with the human subject. We don't say that the human subject gambles to punish himself, as the Freudians might say, or gambles because he feels excited when he does so. Nothing of the sort. People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows. And this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes. Well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on, have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, we find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And, of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act or will, and eventually I think we need to attribute nothing to it.
Now that you have seen the video of the experiment and you must have heard the comments by Skinner, so you must be having some clear understanding about the operant conditioning. Primarily, it's based on the positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, and scheduling of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement in the form of a food given to the animal, negative reinforcement in sense of avoiding or removing something which is painful, and punishment is imposing of a painful deterrent or a painful behavior. And scheduling of reinforcement is looking at the effects it had on the learning speed and the extinction. The extinction is sometimes happens when the acts are repeated and they are not acknowledged, or despite the repeated act, food is not given to the animal, so that leads to the extinction of that behavior. To conclude, According to Skinner, verbal behavior, like other behavior, is controlled by its consequences, and that an animal's or person's behavior is determined by the consequences of the past behavior and reinforcement, which is called operant conditioning.